God's word this morning and proclaim that same word, I invite you to join in the unison prayer for illumination printed in your bulletin. Gracious God, we do not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from your mouth. Make us hungry for this heavenly food, that it may nourish us today in the ways of eternal life. Through Jesus Christ, the bread of heaven. Amen. Our scripture reading from the Old Testament this morning is from the Psalms, the book of Psalms, and we read from part of Psalm 95 this morning, the first 7 verses. Come, let us sing for joy to the Lord. Let us shout aloud to the rock of our salvation. Let us come before him with thanksgiving and extol him with music and song. For the Lord is the great God, the great King above all gods. In his hand are the depths of the earth, and the mountain peaks belong to him. The sea is his, for he made it, and his hands formed the dry land. Come, let us bow down and worship. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker, for he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture, the flock under his care. Today, if only you would hear his voice. Our New Testament reading is from the Gospel of Matthew as we continue to look at the story told through Matthew's viewpoint, and as we wrap up some of that before we enter into Lent and move throughout the Gospels. Our reading this morning comes from Matthew 14, and we will begin reading from chapter 14, but the 13th verse through to the end of that section, the end of that chapter in verse 34. Hear God's word for us. Jesus walks on the water. Immediately, bump down there. Jesus feeds the 5,000. Ahead of myself. And when Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so that they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." "We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they answered. "Bring them here to me," Jesus said, and he directed the people to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. And now Jesus walks on the water. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. And when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," Jesus said. And then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped Jesus, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." And when they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret. And when the men of that place recognized Jesus, they sent word to all the surrounding country. People brought all their sick to him and begged him to let the sick just touch the edge of his cloak. And all who touched it were healed. This is God's holy word for us this day. These are both familiar stories, but what importance do they have for us this morning, we might ask? We have journeyed with Jesus from the Jordan River, where he was baptized by his cousin John the Baptizer, went into the wilderness where Jesus fasted and was tempted and tested, and then Jesus began his teaching, calling 12 men to follow him, and next he began preaching with the Sermon on the Mount, which included the reminder of the rules and the laws, and then the sharing of the parables, some of those to the crowds, and some just to the disciples. We sense a change throughout these events. Jesus has moved from the area outside Jerusalem, the wilderness, along the Jordan River, and now has moved to the northern territory of Galilee, where most of his early ministry took place. He is growing in his ministry. People are starting to follow him and listen to his teachings. They're starting to pay attention to this teacher. Jesus is also stirring things up, especially the leaders in the towns where he is teaching, preaching, and healing. Jesus has moved from the year of popularity into the time of opposition. These stories across the Gospels are stories of testing the waters, pushing the limits in this period when Jesus is making enemies while at the same time gaining followers. The feeding of 5,000 is in all four of the Gospels, and apparently an important story for all four writers to include. Only Luke doesn't share the story of Jesus walking on the water, although he does share a story in its place of Peter declaring Jesus' identity instead. Although he does, both of these stories take place in the evening or at night, and away from the towns where Jesus has spent the bulk of his ministry of teaching. So the scene is changing as well. We also need to put our stories into context of what was going on in that time frame. A look at the passage right before the feeding of 5,000 reminds us that John the Baptizer has just been killed. John's disciples came and took his body and buried it, Matthew's Gospel says. Then they went and told Jesus. After Jesus has been told of his cousin's death at the hands of King Herod Antipas, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Jesus actually may be fleeing Herod and his threats, and not the people crowding to hear him teach. But when the people hear of him leaving town, They follow Jesus on foot. Jesus is mourning the death of John, looking for time away. So he escapes to the boat. He tries to get away by himself. After being out in the boat, searching and seeking some quiet time, Jesus sees the crowds of people gathered at the shore. Despite traveling on foot, they are waiting for Jesus when his boat arrives on the other side of the sea. He wanted to escape, but the crowd followed him. He has nothing. But wait a minute, in the midst of his mourning, Jesus finds compassion for the people. We are told he has compassion on them and heals their sick. Jesus had compassion for all of them. That is what is drawing people to Jesus' ministry, the power of compassion. The compassion that Jesus offers is tangible, the health and well-being of the people. Evening is approaching. Remember, this is a remote place where the crowd of 5,000 men plus women and children have walked to. As the sun goes down, the disciples start to fret. An evening in the wilderness is a problem. They usually don't offer Jesus advice, but here, focusing precisely on the late hour and the wilderness location, they do. Jesus, you should finish up healing and sharing compassion and send them all home, or at least into the closest village to get something to eat. Did you hear that? The crowd doesn't ask for food. They aren't even complaining. The disciples are the ones concerned. The crowds have followed Jesus into the wilderness. Perhaps they are escaping as well. Are they running away from the scarcity, the economics, the oppression, the political pressure that they are sensing throughout Galilee? But the disciples have dragged the concerns and the issues of the towns right out into the wilderness with them. The disciples think Jesus needs to take care of all these people that have followed, leaving their towns behind. Or maybe the disciples had nothing like Jesus before they had landed on the shore. No energy, no time, tired, done for the day. God works best with nothing. The place where God's best work is on display is when there is nothing. Jesus sees things differently. Jesus tells the disciples, the people don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. Here in a deserted place as night falls, the economic and social realities of the Roman Empire in Galilee do not hold. Jesus has already given his disciples power to cast out unclean spirits, heal, even raise the dead, and proclaim God's reign. Now, he holds them accountable for the responsible exercise of that power. The compassion is proactive. Jesus, who has been healing many, is attentive to the basic human needs of the people. And he calls on the disciples to see that too, to share compassion with the crowd. But the disciples remind Jesus that they have nothing but 5 loaves and 2 fishes. Barely enough to feed themselves. Precious little even for 12 disciples, but more than enough in the empire of heaven as we remember in the parable of East from last week. Jesus' actions, taking the loaves and fishes, looking up into heaven, giving thanks, breaking the loaves, giving them to the disciples, anticipates the Last Supper. Jesus did the same with the fish. And then the disciples feed the people, passing the 5 loaves and 2 fish among the crowd of 5,000 men. The women and children were close, but off by themselves, nearby. Because out in public, Jewish women and children were not to be seen eating with the men. The baskets are blessed, the bread broken and passed. They all ate and were satisfied. But that isn't all. The disciples then gathered what was left over so that nothing was wasted. What they gathered filled 12 baskets with pieces of the original 5 barley loaves. Where the crowd and the disciples only saw scarcity, Jesus created abundance. Not only is everyone filled, but there are leftovers. God is at work. The disciples are drawn in as participants in the new order God is establishing in the world. There are even leftovers for the disciples themselves to eat. And the 12 baskets of leftovers are reminders of the 12 tribes of Israel. In the Gospel according to John, after the crowd had been fed, the people begin to say, "Surely this is the prophet who has come into the world." One wonders if they are remembering that through Moses, God had provided food and water for their ancestors in the wilderness. Here, they are seeing the power of God through Jesus the Christ, who they had not yet recognized nor received as the Messiah, Son of God. Jesus, we are told, sensed that the crowd intended to make him king by force. So he headed out towards the mountain by himself. Jesus rejected the widely held Jewish view of the Messiah's kingship. Jesus agrees that he has a kingdom, the kingdom of heaven, but asserts that it is not the kind of kingdom that has soldiers to fight for it, nor is it built or maintained by military force and might. It is perhaps this threat of the crowd crowning him as king that sends him from the wilderness to the mountain for some more time alone. Quiet time in prayer. The crowd is dismissed and sent home with full stomachs. Meanwhile, the disciples get into the boat and start rowing for the other side as Jesus has instructed. All of this seems to be done in haste. We hear the word immediately 3 times in this story. Perhaps the mood has changed. The crowd is recognizing power in this son of Nazareth and wants to put a crown on him. The disciples may be caught up in all the excitement and need to be removed from the area as well before things get out of control. As the sun goes down, Jesus is gone, the crowd's dispersed, and the disciples are out on the water. It is nighttime. Jesus is on the mountain alone, and the boat is way out in the lake. The wind has picked up on the Sea of Galilee, and the boat is being buffeted as a storm moves in. While Jesus prays alone on the mountain, a storm batters the disciples' boat in the middle of the sea. Shortly before dawn, between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m., Jesus leaves the mountain and walks out to them. Jesus' divine power is on full display as he walks out from the shore, walking on the water. Imagine what the disciples saw in the midst of stormy waters rocking the boat. The fog settled in over the water. Maybe they don't even see the shore. There they were, way out near the middle of the lake, straining at the oars because the wind was against them. The water was rough, waves washing up on the sides of the fishing boat. Sea, storm, and nighttime all convey a sense of chaos and threat. Before the sun had begun to rise, the disciples see a figure looking like a ghost on the water near them. During the darkest hour of the early morning, Jesus comes to them on the wild sea. The disciples' cry of terror is a typical response when humans encounter God. Also, a typical response for 12 men scared that their boat is about to capsize in the middle of stormy waters, seeing a ghost walking on the water. The disciples cried out in fear, but immediately a familiar voice spoke to them. Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. Where have we heard those words before? The middle clause, it is I, are definitely words of reassurance. But the words literally are, I am, the Greek rendering of God's name. God is here in the storm. Matthew is the only writer who adds the account of Peter joining Jesus outside the boat, thereby challenging our assumptions about the boundaries between human and divine. Images of divine presence and power overflow in this story. But Peter stands out as the disciple who alone replies to Jesus once he is recognized as the one standing on the water near the boat. Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water. Jesus' invitation is, come, for it is the Lord. It is the Son of God, Jesus the Christ. When Peter recognizes Jesus, he seems to wonder whether if Jesus can walk on water, he can too. After all, they have been learning to carry out ministry like Jesus. Jesus immediately approves Peter's request to join him on the water, which indicates that Jesus does not regard Peter's request as inappropriate, even if the other disciples might. Maybe the exercise of divine power is not limited to Jesus. So Peter climbs out and walks to Jesus. Step one, then another, and then another. Peter is walking towards Jesus on the water of the Sea of Galilee. But when he sees the wind, his human imagination once again exerts itself. Wait a minute, I'm human and I'm not supposed to be able to walk on water. After Jesus reaches out to save him, the same gesture of Jesus reaching out in the stories of healing, by the way, he chides Peter for his little faith and doubt. Little faith here describes Peter's failure of of nerve causing him to sink, not his yearning. Doubt, used only here and in Matthew 28, verse 17, where the disciples first encounter the resurrected Jesus, carries the sense of standing in two places or being of two minds. Peter loses his footing and sinks when his human perceptions of reality overwhelm his perception of divine power. When Peter and Jesus climb back into the boat, the wind dies down. But the story doesn't end there. Instead, the story concludes as the disciples worship Jesus. And for the very first time, they confess that Jesus is the Son of God. This is the first time the disciples use the full title in addressing Jesus. They are now echoing the words heard on the banks of the Jordan River a couple years beforehand as Jesus was baptized, where God, the voice from heaven, called, "My Son, whom I love, with him I am well pleased." Here the disciples worship and praise Jesus with, "Truly, you are the Son of God." The boat arrives on the other side of the lake, landing at Gennesaret. The men there also recognize Jesus. The word begins to spread to all the surrounding towns. Jesus' compassion and healing were recognized and then shared, and people began bringing sick to Jesus, believing simply to touch the edge of his cloak was enough. "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed," a woman who had bled for 12 years said. All who touched it were healed. Jesus' compassion is the underlying concept throughout all of Jesus' ministry. It's the foundation. At this stage of his ministry, he enlists the disciples as the hands and feet of that compassion. He is teaching them, leading and guiding them, mentoring them to not just heal and care for people like he can, but to use Christ's power of compassion. To feed a community that didn't even ask to be fed. To reach out and heal anyone who asked or simply got close enough to touch. These are stories where the disciples and even the people of the towns are starting to stand up and recognize Jesus as the divine man that he is. But they are also beginning to recognize and experience Jesus' power. The disciples are still struggling to understand and recognize Jesus, but they are starting to find their way. This man that they chose to leave everything behind for and follow. This teacher of many confusing parables. The healer full of compassion. And now, Son of God. They don't fully recognize it all yet, but they're starting to get it. And as we finish up the season of Epiphany, we find ourselves remembering the teachings, the healings, and the miracles. The world is changing, and Jesus' ministry is transforming the world. We are building to the transfiguration. God's power is loose in the world, but it is utterly unlike the power of human empires. In time, it will be recognized as the work of Jesus the Christ, Son of God, the human and divine presence and power of God. But it is not yet time, but soon. very soon.